everyone. My name is Dennis Jimenez, and I am a fashion business teacher as well as an alumni from the high school fashion industries. Today, we have the pleasure of interviewing Kristen Naiman, who is the Senior Vice President of Brand Creative for Kate Spade, New York. Thank you so much for taking the time out and joining us today.
I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you, thank you. So I wanted to get right into the question. So I wanted to start off by asking you if you could walk us through the journey that got you to your current position from beginning.
Great, I can definitely do that. I think actually I like to say that, like the sort of good news and bad news about my career is it's like probably not easy to replicate because it's had many like long winding paths and roads and lots of diversions and lots of things that maybe at some point didn't feel like they were going to thread back together and braid into one single career. But in the end, I think that I've followed all like the threads of my interests and that they sort of brought me to this place of being uniquely suited to do this job that I do, which is really to oversee storytelling for the brand. So I started out, just in a shortly, I started out as a stylist. I was in college and I had to take a semester off of college and I was studying writing. I wasn't studying anything
I see that, and I wanted to ask you like what led you to go from writing to styling.
So I was studying writing, and I really am, and I do believe I'm a storyteller, but since I was a teeny tiny kid, I think that in lots of ways clothes were really my first language. And when I think about my job, I feel like I'm telling stories with the product as the words to the stories that I tell. And that's how I think about it now. But at the time, I didn't know any of that. I just was needing to take a semester off of college for some family reasons.
Okay.
And I had some friends. I was working as a bartender, like college semester off.
Wow.
And I had some friends.
Different jobs.
So many different jobs. And I had some, and I really, I like love and really cherish all of them. But I had some friends that were working in magazines, and they knew a stylist who needed an assistant, and they were like, hey, you should do that during the day. And I was like, what's a stylist? I didn't even know what a stylist was. But I was always somebody who was very, very, very interested in style from a tiny young kid. So I started working for this stylist, and I really fell in love with the idea of using clothes to describe things. So first in editorial and pictures, you'd tell stories and editorial stories by using those products to express what you were looking to express. And then after a couple years doing that, I ended up leaving college and going and being a stylist because I loved it.
You never finished at the new.
I ended up going back later, but I spent the first, from maybe 19 to 25, I spent working as a stylist. And first, at magazines. And I was really interested in kind of the way that editorial stories could create a whole world with visual elements, and tell you a whole story visually. And then, I started thinking a lot about, I've always been really interested in people and in kind of in psychology. And I started thinking about the way that in those stories you're making characters with the clothes. So I met a woman who was the head of A&R at a record label at the time through a friend. And she was like, you'd probably be really good at dressing musicians because of the way that I was thinking about clothes, which is like clothes as a form of expression for an individual.
Personalized too, because it's one individual versus so many different people.
Totally. And so I started dressing musicians, and I really fell in love with that, which was like, basically helping them figure out their truth, like helping them figure out what they were essentially. And because they're public figures and need to project that into the world, we would come up with like a visual style language to sort of brand them so that they could communicate really clearly to the world what they were all about, what their art was all about, what their music was all about. And I really, after that, I was like, that to me was just like, like so exciting because it really activated the power that fashion has to.
Let me ask you a quick question about that. Did you find like with certain artists that you struggled to find that unique style? Like they didn't know what style they wanted to go for, and if you did, then how did you overcome that?
What's interesting is what I always found was that the problem wasn't usually that they didn't know what style they wanted to go for. The problem was before that, which is they didn't know what they wanted to project in the world. Like usually if there was a problem with the style, it was because there was a confusion about like what is this music really all about, and who, like there was some deeper confusion about it. And sometimes people knew what their music was all about but didn't understand how that translated visually, and that was an easier solve because you could sort of figure out how to give people the words to their stories. But it usually fell along the lines of like the clearer you were about the story you were telling, the easier it was to identify the elements that could tell that story.
Yes. So I wanted to go back to your current position. So how long have you been at this current role?
So I've been there about 7.5 years.
Wow. So where were you prior to being at Kate Spade?
So for about 8 years before that, I worked for Isaac Mizrahi, who is an incredible icon, a New York icon. And he was an amazing person to learn from because he's a real iconoclast. We did it all. We made wedding gowns for Saudi princesses, and we made stuff for QVC and everything in between. And he made incredible costumes for Mark Morris and the ballet. And like, he was just an eclectic, extraordinary New York creative. And he was such a fun person to learn from because it was very intellectual, but also very friendly and approachable. And it was really a great experience.
I could imagine. I feel like you probably learned so much more about yourself, about styling, and really helped you to fulfill your current position.
Definitely.
So tell me about a typical day in your role. How would Monday go about?
You mean like right now during COVID?
Yes.
So
questions.
So this is real scary. So I don't know if I should tell you the truth, but I guess in the spirit of always telling the truth, I'm going to tell you the truth, which is yesterday I was on Zoom from 8 o'clock in the morning till 7:45 at night without pause. So that is encompassing of, at any given time, a ton of different projects that I'm working on. So right now we're working on executing campaigns for summer, ideating campaigns for fall, planning the storytelling that's going to be for holiday. I'm working with the team on all of the persistent day in, day out work. So it's like Instagram and email and the site. I'm working on a customer profile project that explores and sort of expresses who the customer is in a lot of fun, vivid detail so that the whole of the organization can really make sure that that customer is always sort of the North Star. I'm working on a store experience project where we're really assessing, what are the role of stores today? Like, what are the role of them and how do we use them now? And what do they need to look and feel like? And, I'm starting off a branding conversation around doing some branding work. So it's like very, very eclectic, and we're working on some books. Kate Spade's always made books.
Yeah. We
have 2 books we're working on for 2022. And, for me, that's really why it's such a uniquely good job for me. And it's not one I could have arrived at in a linear way, because every single day from 8 in the morning till 7:45 last night, it pulled on so many different facets of my creativity and my intellect, and sort of like asked for all different parts of me, which I think is like, whenever you're looking to build a career, I think knowing what you love and what you're good at, and accepting and being generous with yourself that they may not all seem like the obvious things that stack together, but if you just keep following along all of those threads, eventually they braid together to be something that only you can do. So I'm a huge believer in that.
Definitely. I feel like sometimes people get frustrated if their career is not linear from beginning to end. Because they're like, I'm not in the right career, but I feel like all these little jobs get you to that main job. And sometimes you don't even know what that main job might be, so.
Totally.
Beautiful. So what would you say is your favorite part of your job in the last 8 years?
Oh my God. There have been different ones at different points, like creatively, I really love telling stories. And so when I have things that are really rich for storytelling, I always love those. Like for a while, we made a film series called Misadventure that was basically like the teeniest, tiniest, episodic little TV show kind of. And I really loved making those because you have to write them, you have to style them, you have to figure out the locations, you have to work with the director on the lighting and the positioning. And like, the crescendo of all of those visual and verbal elements together to create a story that really makes people feel like all encompassed. I find those kinds of projects really gratifying. I also really love doing all this customer profile work. For me, it's like about building these personas and really like trying to understand with like a generous and very human way who you're talking to. You know, one of the things that happened after I was working with those musicians is that I was working with a group of musicians, and I hand embroidered myself this jean jacket, this vintage jean jacket with these like crazy vines all over it. And one of the musicians wore it in Spin magazine, which is no longer, but used to be a very great music magazine. And the Gap saw it and they called me and they were like, "Hey, where'd you get that jacket?" And I was like, "Well, I made it." And they were like, "Well, we want to make it. Can we make it? Can we like buy it off of you?" And they actually reproduced this jacket. They had this like vintagey, heritagey line at the time. So they reproduced the jacket. And through that, I met the head of concept there, who then hired me to come in. I was really young at the time, you know, I was like in my early 20s, and she hired me to come in and like help them with like cool record stores and cool things to look at and what are cool new brands and like what are the kids wearing and like all this kind of stuff, you know. And at that moment, I really, really fell in love with brands because I realized that what I had loved about working with musicians, brands were doing at a cultural level. So if I'm helping a musician pull out the core of who they are and express it through clothes, then brands are reading the cultural temperature and they're understanding what's going on at culture in any given moment. And if they're doing their jobs well, they're identifying how people want to look and feel, and they're making those products, they're making those words to each of those individual stories, and then they're selling it to them so those people can take those products and wield them in the world and wear them in the world and use them for their own stories and their own self-expression. And when I realized that, and that's what these concept teams were doing, and that's what the job of a fashion brand was, and not only was that gonna like be the thing that made them financially successful, but it's also the thing that makes it relevant culturally. Then I just really fell in love with brands. So still today for me, that process is my favorite, and really thinking like, who is this customer? Like, what is she thinking about? What does she want to be talked to about? How does she want to look? What is she looking to present herself as in the world? And really like dreaming that up and articulating it in a way that the people throughout the organization find inspiring. To me, that's like really like one of the most joyous parts of my job, but also in some ways like the most fundamental.
I definitely teach my students. Last semester I was teaching fashion merchandising, and we were talking about consumer profiles, and I had them like create like their perfect consumer. Who is she? Where does she live? Where does she shop? What are her favorite stores and such? So I wanted to hear from you, like, how do you develop a consumer profile or profiles?
Sure. We actually just undertook a huge project about this summer, so it's very fresh in my mind, and we're still doing a few more. And I've done it a lot of different ways over the course of my career, but the most recent way that we did it was so great. And it was developed by a CMO that I was working with. And I really, really loved her thinking, and I think it wielded a really excellent product. So basically, they took a bunch of consumer data that our data teams had acquired that were really all about the customer who exists out there in the world. And it was like, our consumer teams developed these 4 personas. And they were like, these are the 4 personas that are out there in the world. And this one persona seems like uniquely suited for you to take more market share from. But the personas were very dry, and they were kind of, data-driven, sort of statistical. Like they weren't vivid. Like you couldn't hand them to someone and say, like, you know who this woman is. You can like feel in yourself who it is. So she and I took that data and we polled the entirety of the internal Kate Spade organization, who is, in a lot of ways like our first and best customer, especially when a brand's doing their job right. I think the people who work at the brand are devotees, So we polled them and we identified them. We organized them all into the groups that they fell into. There were 4 consumer profiles, and we renamed those profiles. They were based off the original data, but we renamed them. And then I did qualitative interviews with each of those profiles in focus groups of about 6 or 7 people. And it was really qualitative. It was like really about their lives and like, who were they and how did they think about getting dressed and where do they go and what do they do and what do they prioritize and how do they want to be seen by the world and what podcasts do they like and what books do they read, and like just really tons of that.
Yeah, for us to know like who that customer is on every level.
On every level. And so then my team and I, the creative team, we aggregated all of that information together, and we basically used it to paint this. It's like about a 30-page document that paints this picture of who this woman is. Here's who we think she is. We wrote like a little synopsis of who we think she is. We like put a whole bunch of pictures together. Then we put a mood board of her life. Then we talked about, what does her home look like? What is her Google search history read as? What does her Instagram look like? What podcasts, what books, what movies? How does she dress for this occasion? How does she dress for that occasion? What's her relationship to her friends? What's her relationship to her alone time? What's her relationship to her wellness? What's her relationship to, parties? And we built this whole profile that we basically paints the picture of this woman, so that when the design teams, the merchandising teams, the international teams are making decisions, they can make it against this idea of, does what I'm doing speak to this woman? And it's been great, and everybody has really loved it, and it's been
very fun and very exciting to develop. And I'll definitely have to incorporate that into my lessons, because I've never thought about it on that level. Like, what does she Google? Like, what does she like to eat? What does she do at home when she's alone? So,
yeah. For me, I feel like what I always tell my teams is that specificity is universality. And that when you read a really great novel or you watch a really amazing movie, it's the specific little details that ring super true to you that make you see the universal in it. And so when you're writing customer profiles and stuff, when you say things that are super general, it falls flat for people. Like, she likes to have fun, and you're like, but if you say sort of like, this is a list of the 10 things she does with her alone time. She has dinner at a girlfriend. One of her favorites, what are her 10 favorite spaces for her alone time? And it's like her best friend's dining room table, an afternoon stroll through the city with the person she loves, a, daytime matinee on a hot, sticky summer Friday, then you're like, yeah, I got it. I know who that is. I know who she is.
Yeah. Perfect. Beautiful. So now let me ask you on the other end, what would be your least favorite? And you have to do this, you're dreading it from beginning to end, but you get it done, of course, because it's a job, but.
Well, I am like embarrassingly terrible at certain types of organization. And I find it really like embarrassing and stressful. And I try to cut myself a break and just like ask for people to help me. And I have some awesome people who help me, and I help them back in the ways that I'm really talented, but sort of like, helping me. My way of ideating can be very circular. So helping me like just get it mapped out and on paper, or, helping me present that material to people so it makes a lot of sense to them. So I think knowing your strengths and weaknesses and allowing other people to fill in where you're weak, and doing the same for others is like a very necessary part of any job,
Yeah. No, I think that's very important to understand very well those strengths and weaknesses, so that way you could collaborate with others that have that strength that you struggle with. So that's really good. So let me ask you, so a lot of the students always want to know, what are some skills to be successful in the industry? What would you recommend for them starting now in high school?
Well, I think curiousness is super, super important, like being voraciously curious. Because I think this is a job, like I said before, about observation and understanding the world that you're in, and understanding that your work is speaking to the world about what the world, like that's what fashion does at its best and most profound, is it expresses a cultural moment in a way that people feel seen and known. So being endlessly curious about like, what is that cultural moment? Like what's going on in the world, that's one thing. I think resilience is another one. And I think that's true of any career, but I think that like, there's nobody in my entire life, worth their salt who hasn't failed a whole lot. And I know that sounds very pat, and people say it all the time, especially like successful people, but when I say fail, I don't just mean like, oh, that project didn't work out, but like go through really hard, struggly times where you're like, I just don't know if I can do this. And you're like, I think that you can. You just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other. So I think resilience is super important. I think communication skills are an important and undervalued thing, which is like, if we're storytellers in the end, knowing how to tell your story to others and bring them along on your vision and your ride is critical. And having run creative teams for a very long time with hugely creative people, they often don't know how to do that. So they tend to drop people in the middle of their stories, or they drop them into the details right away. And understanding that if you have a vision for things, then part of your vision is about selling that vision to others in a way that makes them see it too. So communication skills, I think, are super important. I think being a good writer, being articulate, being able to think through a story and an idea in a linear way, those are all really helpful things. So like working hard on those, even if you're like loving your drawing classes and loving your sketching classes and all of that, like making sure that you have those is really important. Yeah,
that's one of the classes, yeah, that I'm currently teaching, the communication class. And I always tell the students, like, your main focus is always who is your audience, and then basing off that, what type of style you're going to present to them, because your message is key. If you don't use the correct communication style, then it doesn't matter what you say, what you write, because it doesn't connect with them. So
totally.
Yeah. So now let me ask you, so how has business changed for you, your day-to-day life, prior to COVID and now during COVID?
I mean,
would it just be the
yeah, I think there's the normal stuff, which is just like the blurring between the personal and the professional. I mean, like, I'm wearing a striped t-shirt, like we don't get dressed up anymore. And there's something about getting dressed up that's like, you know, you put your armor on and you go out into the world, you go out into your day. And I think there's something about COVID that in a really nice way, and also in a way that's sometimes challenging, has made things much more personal and sort of teared down some of all of that kind of like structure for life, you know? Some of the ways we work are different, you know, like in the same way, it's like I run a team where now everybody is the same size on the screen, and that really fosters like a different kind of conversation. And we've also learned to use technology in a really interesting way. Like, I always joke that we used to have these creative reviews where the team would like come into the office with these boards and all their work pinned onto the board, and we would look at the board and then they'd march out with the board after the feedback, and 2 days later they'd come in with a new board all pinned together. And now we do it all live in real time on Zoom, you know, like they'll share their screen and we look at their email or whatever it is, and we talk about how it needs to be different or whatever. And they change it in real time. They design it in real time as we're sitting there, and we move on. So I think some of that, it's almost like COVID just gave us this opportunity to kind of catch up with ourselves. It's like we had all this technology that could facilitate a different kind of working, but we were still stuck in it. Like the thought of like printing everything out and putting it on boards, like we're never going to do that again.
Yeah.
We're just going to share on a screen, you know? So there's a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah, it's definitely more interactive. And I feel like I personally enjoy that more. Even though I do enjoy the person to person being live with someone, but yeah, you have to move with the times. So let me ask you, so what other positions or industries could someone with a similar background and experience as you could pursue?
Well, with a similar background to me, I think there are lots of things.
Interested in what other careers or positions?
For me,
hypothetically, would you be interested if you didn't have the one you currently have?
Well, I've always thought that I would have loved to have been a film director, like a writer and director of films. I think I would have really enjoyed that. I'm also really interested in psychology, and I think it goes hand in hand with this. And sometimes I think like in my next act, I had different threads of sort of psychology in my early days in my background. And I do think I use that work and that thinking all the time in the work that I do. And sometimes I think in my next act, maybe I would like, you know, incorporate that more heavily into what I do, like, you know, work as someone who helps both brands and individuals like CEOs or athletes or whatever figure out their ness or their truth, using both psychology and branding, and then help them develop strategies for expressing it, you know, something like that. Because I think for me, like, good branding is good psychology, you know, they're very intertwined. So psychology, and then also like, you know, I love beauty, which is some of how I got into this. So like, I'm crazy about cooking. I love to garden, you know, and I think both of those things are things that really like feed my creativity. So I don't know if I would want to do them professionally because then sometimes it kills the love, but I definitely feel like those are other psychology, gardening, cooking, film. And also I always wished I could be Terry Gross. I always was like, I just want to be Terry Gross. I just want to have a job where my whole job is just to talk to amazing people.